Hey everyone, this is your lecture on principles of motion and stability. We'll go through it, so make sure to ask questions afterwards because we'll go through it a little bit abridged and have you guys just answer some questions on your own. So feel free to pause the video, kind of think about them, and then continue on. So let's see if it'll change. Perfect. So, why is it important to understand movement? Well, we've talked a lot in class already. Understanding movement allows us to be able to break it down and help people work where they may have deficiencies, keep people at risk from injuries, rehabilitation, make sure they develop correctly. So there's all kinds of things for that. And so when we think about movement, again, we've talked about motor development and motor skills. We talked last time, I believe, about motor development occurs similar in different people. So it's very predictable. It may happen at different times, but the steps for motor development are pretty sequential and happen in everyone pretty much the same. And so these similarities occur because there are constraints that we all operate under. So things like gravity, how we interact in different contexts. So the things we tend to do and how we walk and surfaces all tend to be generally the same. And so you tend to learn from those. But that's part of that motor development. And then also related to that is motor skills. So learning how our human body works in the boundary of the physical laws. So laws of motion and gravity and all the things to do with physics. And so we have to learn kind of how to calibrate ourselves in this environment. How do we manipulate that? And so astronauts, when they go into space where there's low gravity, they have to learn how to adjust for this, their motor skills to adjust to those, and it can take some time. And so, one example of your motor skills, learning how to use your body in this environment with gravity per se, is picking up an empty box when you thought it was full. That jerk of I used way too much force, and how you adjust for those types of things. And so, part of what we know that helps us improve our motor development and these movements is as our body size increases, we typically tend to increase strength, which allows us to increase the forces we can produce, which is great. But it's not just about the size and the strength alone. We know that plays a big role. As a kid gets older, they have strength to actually do things. But that alone doesn't account for all the progression from someone being unskilled at a particular activity to being skilled. So think a professional athlete versus someone who's doing it. Size and strength isn't the only thing. And so some of those changes are going to occur by mastering and exploiting principles of motion and stability, which is kind of what this lecture is talking about. So when it comes to motion and stability, developmental changes in movement occur according to some biomechanical principles. And so motion and stability, so movement and then kind of staying upright, that stability, how stable are you, kind of think about that question, are two principles within the larger field of biomechanics. So biomechanics, how the body moves, and then you can kind of narrow down into motion itself and stability, and there are others. And these are known as the physics of movement. You have to kind of look at these. They're really required to be able to look at movement. You have to have motion and stability. And so they help us to determine patterns and how we are likely to produce the optimal results. Like these two things together can play into that optimizing the most efficient or the fastest or being the best. And so one example of this is children may execute a particular movement pattern, or so a jump or something along those lines, in a way that is most efficient for them, given their body size and their strength and their posture and experience, even. But this pattern will more than likely change over time. If you ever watch someone jump or throw a ball for the first time, especially if they're smaller and younger, they do it one way, and then as they gain experience, their posture changes, their strength, they start to change that motion to be able to give in to those. So, what I would encourage you to do is click on get the PowerPoint, click on A, click on B, watch the videos, and see what changed. And you should see a pretty big difference based on the strength, the size, the experience. Like you should be able to see kind of what you're looking for there. And so, related to all of this, we do talk about the laws of physics to some extent, or Newton's first, second, and third law play into our motion and stability and the way we look at the human body. It's not irrelevant. We can't just put those aside and say those are physics laws and our body doesn't play a role in that. It plays a huge role. And so Newton's first law is an object at rest stays at rest, an object in motion stays at motion unless it's acted upon by an outside force. Outside is kind of key there. And so part of Newton's first law is we have an inertia, which is a resistance to motion related to mass. So inertia is how much force typically is it taking to get something moving. The resistance to wanting to move is inertia. Momentum is the product of mass and velocity, so what's going to keep it going. And so with all of this, you have to start realizing that we have to exert forces in order to move objects or even ourselves. And more inertia means that it's harder to move. So it's harder to move an object that has a lot of inertia. It's wanting to resist that change in its motion, and more force is applied in order to overcome that. And so one example you can do is pause the video here in just a second and lie on the floor on your back and then stand up. What are the different ways that you can do that? You can try to stand straight up without moving. You can try to pull your feet underneath you and stand up to achieve that goal. And so which of these movements is most comfortable? Which ones seem more efficient? Which ones are almost impossible? And start thinking about why that may be. And it comes back to motion, stability, inertia, all of those things that we're talking about today. And so with Newton's first law, think about a child learning to swing a bat. What must the child learn about inertia? Well, the heavier the bat, the bigger the bat, the more effort it's going to take to start that movement. And what must the child learn about momentum? Well, that bat's going to want to continue after you start it. And so how do we slow that down? And a bigger bat, can we slow that down? So to move an object further and faster, which is typically the goal of a lot of activities, is to do it to go further or to do it faster. You have to increase the force delivered to the object. So the more force you can apply to something, the faster it can go or the further it can go. But we can also take and we can increase a distance over which force is applied. So think about trying to push something, right? If you're trying to push it, if you push it for a short distance, it may only go so fast and so far. But if you push it for a greater distance, so kind of think of you back up a little ways, you pull it further away from the line where you have to release it, and you're able to apply force over a longer distance, it may go a little faster and a little further. So adding distance to improve a kick is another example. So maybe you're trying to improve how fast you kick something. So you can increase the step length, so linear distance. So maybe you're taking a bigger step before you kick that ball. That would increase the force for it. But then you could also increase the range of motion. So when you kick your foot, maybe you allow that follow through. Your leg comes up a little higher. You stay in contact with the ball a little bit longer. And so you've increased the time that you're pushing that. So examples of the last two. So that's Newton's first law. And so related to that is Newton's second law. And so Newton's second law, it takes force to move something standing still and a force to change directions of something moving. So basically something has to act outside of the object in order to change its direction. And so really what that is saying is that an object's force is related to its mass and its acceleration. So force is equal to mass times acceleration. And so you have to take both into account. What is the mass of what you're moving? What is the acceleration in order to be able to get that force? And so that really plays a role in that. And so read the cartoon below. And it basically is talking about one person throwing a tennis ball versus another person throwing a football, and they go different distances, and the assumptions that sometimes we make, and the fact that we actually have to look at other things, that force or the mass is also going to play a role. Throwing something larger, it may not go as far, but you may have had to put more effort to get it to go that far than someone throwing a smaller object. So when it comes to this second law, you have to think, especially if we're looking at professional athletes, but kids and anyone in general. Let's say we're talking about throwing a ball. You can only throw as hard as you can possibly throw. That sounds kind of weird, but each of us can only throw so hard. Now, there are ways that we can increase force production. We can maybe add some muscle mass, but at the end of the day, there are limits to how hard we can throw. And professional athletes typically hit that. College athletes a lot of times will hit that. And so if we can't physically throw any harder, we can't add any more force, how could we increase acceleration of throwing a ball? Well, it could be due to the angles. It could be holding on to that ball a little bit longer. So before we release it, so we're applying that force over a greater distance. Or it could be the fact that we change the mass. So maybe you switch to in this case, you can see on the left-hand side, maybe a lighter bat. We decrease the mass. And so these are different things to contend with when you're looking at these principles of motion and stability. So to improve our performance, okay, and again, this is really going to range between the age groups. You've got to find the optimal relationship between force and distance in a given movement. You want a ton of force, and you want to apply it over the longest distance possible, but too much force and performance goes down. Maybe you can't throw it as accurately. If you hold on to it too long, other pieces of physics come into play, and maybe it doesn't come off right. It doesn't have as much spin if you're talking about throwing a baseball. And so you're really trying to do that. And so there are two important phases when it comes to that. There's the preparatory movement, what we do before we start moving or as we're about to start moving to do the task that we're wanting to, and the application of the force through a full range of motion. So again, think about kicking a ball with a greater range of motion in your leg. You stay in contact with the ball a little bit longer, and thus you're able to maybe get it to go a little bit faster, increase the acceleration. So we've got Newton's first law, we've got Newton's second law. So Newton's third law basically is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if you exert force on an object, it's exerting a force on you in an equal but opposite way. So when you push on something, it's pushing back on you. When you are throwing a ball, that ball is actually pushing back on you. And so the mass if the mass is small, you may not even notice it. When the mass is a little bit bigger, you may. So for example of this, if you push against a door or something that's immovable, push against a floor, that opposite reaction may push you backwards. So think of a push-up. When you push against the floor, the opposite reaction, actually the floor pushes back on you and you go upward. Where with a ball that you're throwing or something you're throwing along that, the reaction tends to go the other way of that object moves, and you may not feel that as a reaction, but it's still occurring. So everything kind of pushes back, and that's always good to remember that there are effects, and so you always have to be looking for that. So watch these two videos, and these show you some of these what's called oppositional movements. So you can actually use that to your advantage. You can actually take the force that the ground is applying to you and help you to jump higher. And so we tend to do this and not realize what we're doing. But there's this loading kind of phase where we're using that force we put into the ground that's acting upon us to help us maybe jump higher or run a little bit differently. So when you're exerting a force, it is important for us to remember that there are planes of motion. So there's sagittal plane, there's cross-sectional planes, transverse. And so all of these make a little bit of difference. So force in a plane of motion in which you want to move an object. So if you're wanting to move something in front of you, you want to move in that plane, and force applied outside of that plane can actually be a detriment. It can make it where it's not as efficient, and maybe it doesn't go as fast. And so you see the person here holding a tennis racket. Well, if there's too much rotation with the tennis racket, the ball may not move as fast. Now, you may choose to do this to get some spin on it or other things, but it's going to take away. Anything where we're looking at those forces, they all have to kind of go together. So when it comes to increasing just the sheer velocity, so we're really looking at rotating our limbs. So think about, again, kicking, throwing at those joints in your shoulders and hips. It's rotational. You're moving through this rotation. And so increasing the velocity, the faster you move that, swing it around, the faster it'll go. And this is relative to the length. So if you extend your arm fully, it's going to go around quicker one full time than if you pull your arm in. Okay, so just think about that. Like, look at your arm, swing it at the same speed around, and look at your elbow, how quickly it moves versus how quickly the hand moves. Okay, and what you'll notice is the hand actually moves a lot quicker. It's covering a lot more distance in the same amount of time, and so that can help us to increase that velocity. So look at these two videos and you'll watch what happens. You can actually have too much rotational inertia, so where it's really hard to slow that leg down, it can cause injuries, it can cause you not to be as accurate, and so we do have to uh, kind of manage this, and we learn this through time with experiences. So another thing to note is that force over time makes a difference. So when we talk about um, kind of throwing objects, we talked about how if you can apply a force over a greater amount of time, the velocity can go up. But we also have to think about there are plenty of applications where we may need to slow something down, or we're trying to bring something back to rest where it's not moving. And so we have to absorb that force that's coming into us. And so one way that you can look at this is we can take a lot of force and do it very quickly, or we can take smaller amounts of force and spread that over time and get the same result. Um, so again, this can be seen in both the way of moving something and stopping something. So karate chop of bricks, usually the contact time is going to be really long to apply more force over that time. But if we're stopping it, you may want to do a soft landing as a gymnastics. And so you'll notice in this picture, they're bending their knees. And all that is trying to increase the amount of time to absorb that force. If you've ever jumped up and landed with your legs locked, it hurts. There's a lot of force transferred through the body, and it happens very quickly. If you allow your knees to bend some, even though that time difference is not that greater, that force is dissipated a little bit more, and it's not as painful. So again, experienced people tend to kind of pick this up over time, but they're not realizing what's happening of this force absorption. So to decrease the impact of any particular force, you can increase the amount of time in which that impact occurs, or you can increase the area that it occurs. Either one of these would be effective at absorbing that force. Um, so again, thinking about the jumping and bending your knees, or when you catch a ball, especially if you do it without a glove, most people tend to catch that ball and then bring it in at the same time. You're decreasing that force. You kind of allow your arms to bend to bring that in. Where if we give you a glove with a wider surface area, you can catch that ball and maybe your arms don't move as much because that surface area is uh, spreading that force over, and so we don't have to bring our arms in. So you can try this, catch a ball with a glove and then catch a ball without a glove, and you can see those differences as you go. So other things to note as it comes to all of our forces and motion and the laws of that is um, for most movements, there is a correctly timed sequence that allows you to perform at your best. So again, think of any movement that you would like to. So we have a soccer throw in at this point on the image. And so if done correctly, there's a certain skill of how everything kind of goes. It's this kinetic chain where things build on top of each other, and it's open because we're not constrained by it. And so if done correctly, we get the best results. And if there's a break in this kinetic chain, it ball may not go as far, it may not go as fast. And so there's two elements to this. So there's optimal sequence of movements exists. So the correct way for these things to flow, and if they don't flow in this order, we get a little bit, but also the timing. So if in throwing this soccer ball in this picture, she starts to move her arms before her legs are set, we will lose some of the force production, some of the velocity, and the ball won't go as far or as fast. And so these are the most significant changes in skill development for children and beginners. They transition from using a single action to putting a group of actions together. Again, think about a child throwing for the first time. They tend to just kind of throw with their wrist, maybe their forearm a little bit. And then as they build that, they start pulling their arm further back. They start to step into that throw, and you see those more often. So with all of the motion, because we talked a lot about Newton's laws of motion, first, third, and third and second law, open connect chains, we also have to consider stability and balance. And stability is the ability to resist movement. So if you're stable, you're not swaying a lot, you are able to resist movement being applied to you. So think about those equal opposite forces that are happening every time we try to move. And balance is the ability to maintain equilibrium, so staying kind of in that one spot. So balance and stability are different. Um, you can be stable and slightly unbalanced. You can be balanced but not necessarily stable. But when those kind of come together, that's the best place for us to be. We are able to do that. And so you've got the little picture in the right hand corner that shows you equilibrium, stability, and then balance. So there is the stability mobility trade off that we have to consider is that um, as we increase stability, so as we become less resistant to being able to movement, the ability, as we increase that resistance to movement, we tend to decrease our mobility. So think about standing. If you stand with your feet together, right, you can move through a wide range of motion. You can have a lot of mobility, but you may not be the most stable. If you put your feet as wide as they possibly can, you may be really stable. It may be really hard to move you, but your mobility um, may be altered as well. And so for skill performers, they're trying to balance this. They're trying to give themselves just enough stability for what they need to be sufficient for the activity, but not so much that it hinders their mobility. And so, in this kind of skill acquisition, skill setting, you're especially in the sports area, athletes are trying to learn where that is for them, and they slowly play with it, and you'll see them fall or do this, that, and the other, and then eventually get that correct. And it's all going to be determined on what is the goal. So, a lineman in football may have a really very stable and not a lot of mobility because they're trying to resist movement, where someone else may go with a much less stable positioning for the movement, like a wide receiver or a kicker. Kickers are a great example. So, increasing stability, we just talked about it. So, you can increase that base of support. You can lower your center of gravity, so get lower to the ground. To increase our balance, we can increase our stability. So, we just kind of mentioned that as well. And then also we can increase our balance through strength, coordination, and proprioception. So figuring out how we communicate all of those together. All of those can increase balance. And so you're trying to get those into harmony along with your mobility. So one of the things you want to look at with your lab is the 5-step process to observing and analyzing a skill performance. We've already talked a little bit about what you need to for Lab 1. You can look at Lab 1 as well. And so you'll want to take these kind of 5 steps to help you with that. So you'll want to observe the complete skill of every person when you're analyzing skill performance. So observe the complete skill, not just one little section of it to begin with. And then after you've observed the complete skill, analyze each phase of it. So the loading phase, the movement phase, all of those different phases, and the key elements that are supposed to be in there. What's supposed to be going on? Use your knowledge of mechanics and your analysis. So the things that we're kind of talking about here, maybe they have a lot of stability, or maybe they don't have enough stability, or their balance or range of motion. Those are things to look at. You look for the errors that can be corrected. So you select which ones are to be corrected. Sometimes you'll see a lot of them, and then you kind of have to figure out which one to focus on first. You may make a list and then figure out which one to focus on first, because it's really hard to change a lot of things at once. And then once you've kind of looked at those, you figure out what's the best method for correcting those errors. What sequence is best, but also what is going to get us there. So if it's too wide of a stability issue, then we bring that stability in. We lower the stability to gain range of motion. And then you may realize you need to adjust the balance at that point because maybe they're unbalanced, and you can work on those things as well. So that wraps this up. If you have any questions,